Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited about this program because it is International Compost Awareness Week, and we'd like to thank Beth Ann for presenting and the UCONN Master Composters program. Beth Ann, you can take it away.
Great, thanks everybody for being here tonight to hear this presentation on saving our planet one food scrap at a time. That's the theme, and it's all about backyard composting, the things that we can do on our own to improve the state of the earth. I had a couple of quotes that I thought might interest you. Composting is not new. It's not a new program or process, and it wasn't just invented a few years ago. Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella in 70 AD, a prominent writer on agriculture in the Roman Empire, wrote, "The earth neither grows old or wears out if it is dunged." And that means if compost is added, is used as an amendment. And George Washington Carver, an amazing agricultural scientist and inventor, wrote, "Throw nothing away, everything can be used again." And maybe the idea of using things and not being wasteful was one of the issues that prompted me to become a composter some 30 years ago. It's kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of, my experience with composting, in terms of whether I've been making a concerted effort or using it more passively. So in any event, here we are. When I retired, I decided that I would take it more seriously. Tonight, I'm going to talk about 4 different things. First, what is composting? Second, why composting matters. It matters a lot to me. Compost ingredients and do's and don'ts, and compost structures, how to contain your compost material. So what is compost? It's organic material that is decomposed. Organic material will decompose all by itself eventually. Might not be fast enough for you to use it in your garden when you want it. So the decomposition process can happen very passively. The pile of leaves in the back corner of my yard, for example, receives very little attention, or it can be controlled more. That is by turning it on a regular basis and making sure that it doesn't dry out and adding new material, kind of paying attention to it. Everything will decompose eventually. You know that when you see dead trees lying on the forest floor, or flowers in your garden that are wilting, they're all participating in this decomposition process. And oil that took millions of years to form underground also went through that decomposition process. But as I say, it's a matter of how long you want to wait, and probably what size compost bins you have. If you want to be passive about it, it requires a lot more room. So what is composting? It's actually the microbial decomposition of organic matter, such as food and yard waste, by bacteria and other microorganisms, or by worms and macroorganisms, beetles and so forth, all in the presence of oxygen and water. It's accelerating the natural decay process. And in this little picture here, you can see the brown matter, which is carbon material that's considered carbon-based. It's leaves, dead stems, not stew, woody materials, and it can include newspaper and other articles that we'll talk about a little bit later, and green material like your leafy greens and grass clippings, food scraps, manures. All that will develop into black gold, this beautiful compost you see on the side of the screen, given the presence of some water and some air, which the macroorganisms like earthworms and insects require, as do microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, and microbes, which are our friends in this process. So why compost? I thought about, well, why do I compost? And I try not to throw much away, especially these days. I think more about what can I do to reduce the amount of material going into Connecticut landfills. About 25% of the material in Connecticut landfills is organic waste, as you can see in this pie chart. In the landfills, it can generate explosive methane gas. It can build there's pressure built up within the pile there. And anyway, it's important to reuse, use, recycle, and so on. And this is the big recycle moment. Soil that's amended properly with compost has enough macro and trace nutrients so that very little fertilizer is actually required. And I'm trying to reduce inputs into my garden, items that I'm bringing in from elsewhere. I'm not using fertilizers. I'm not purchasing them, and I certainly wouldn't use any toxins like synthetic fertilizer. Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't call it that. Herbicides and pesticides, and I don't want to use synthetic fertilizers either. I want to try to return nature to nature. And the other interesting piece of this, another reason to compost is that composting with the microbial activity that takes place can neutralize soil toxins. And it certainly improves soil structure, aeration, water holding capacity, and drainage. By the way, adding nutrients back into your yard is preferable to raking and bagging leaves and grass clippings for disposal, because that's removing essentially all this great organic material from your environment, and you're interrupting the natural nutrient cycle. So in my yard, I'm trying to close the loop. If leaves fall from my trees and I can't mow them into the lawn or mulch them into the lawn, I use my little mulching machine so that I can spread that mulch into the leaf mulch into my gardens. And if I have too many leaves, I throw some in my back pile at the back corner of my yard. And anyway, I'm trying to improve my soil structure through aeration and increasing water holding capacity and improving drainage and improving my pore structure. Since I've been doing this more earnestly, and I completed my master composting classes, I have noticed an incredible difference in the way that my plants, my grass, I try to limit my lawn amount, but the way that my plants and my vegetables, my flowers, my shrubs, everything is healthier, everything's greener. I've had less trouble with plant pests and with plant diseases since I've really incorporated a lot more of my own nutrient enhancing materials from my compost into my yard. There are 4 basic kinds of composting. There's a hot pile, which is defined by a pile that's being well managed and achieving temperatures of between 130 degrees Fahrenheit. There's fast decomposition occurring in this process. And this is what people really want to do if they're deeply engaged with the composting process. At 130 degrees, most plant pathogens start to die, and at about 150 degrees, most weed seeds will die. So that makes this compost that's produced through the hot process much more readily available to put in your gardens. an alternative to that is the cold pile, which isn't actually cold. If you kept things cold, it would be like putting material you didn't want to get rotten, have rot, or decompose on your counter into your refrigerator. So it's actually material that's maintained at ambient temperatures. It's a very passive process, like my leaf pile, and it decomposes very slowly. It may take up to 2 years for the leaves at the bottom of my leaf pile to decompose. However, there have been times in my life when my schedule was so crazy that that's the best I could do. And I was, happy to do that. I was still using the materials from my property, my leaves, my garden clippings, my dead-headed plants, and throwing them into there. And slowly they became available for me to use in my garden. There's anaerobic composting as well, which is generally an accident. This occurs when there's too much water or too little oxygen. Too much water, the ratio of oxygen and water is terrible, and it tends to create this stinky, slimy pile, which neighbors complain about, and it releases methane into the atmosphere. So that's kind of an accident because people are not maintaining their pile properly, and they're putting materials in there. Lots of times it happens because there's too much nitrogen or too much leafy matter and not enough dry matter like dead leaves in the pile. So there isn't enough carbon material there to absorb the moisture, the excessive moisture. And it just becomes matted, like somebody had sat on it, And so there's no air circulating, in the microbes that are in the pile that are trying to break down all the carbon and nitrogen are unable to do their job. They're unable to survive in there, and they're very unhappy. There's another type of anaerobic composting that I am looking into. It's interesting to me. It's like a pickling form, and it's very intentional in limiting the air in the pile. People use a little bin. They use fermented bran to achieve decomposition. So they're making things break down quickly, and they can only do a small amount at a time. But for some people who want to have some kind of a bin inside, it works very well. People who can't go outside with their bins. And the other type is worm composting, vermicomposting. So I have my bin in my basement, and I know there's another program that took place about this, but it is one of the 4 types. So I wanted to describe it. The worms do all their work. It can happen pretty quickly. I bought a worm bin, like the one over in the picture here, and I chose little red wigglers, which don't go anywhere, and they're very shy. They just like to eat and stay in the dark. And I put nice bedding, damp newspaper, not wet. I don't want my worms to drown. And I added the worms and put food in there, that is vegetable scraps. As you probably know, they don't like citrus and they don't like onion family items. So I've made mine very happy. They really love melon and melon peel. And then I add a little more dirt or coconut coir, and a little shredded damp paper on top. And anyway, I almost magically have compost that's done a terrific job for all my plants, indoors and out. The next thing I want to just talk about is, and this is the bulk of the presentation, compost ingredients and do's and don'ts. Hot, cold, and worm composting require 6 basic ingredients to produce a good batch of compost. They need carbon materials, nitrogen materials, microorganisms or invertebrates to break down the carbon and nitrogen materials, oxygen, moisture, and an appropriate temperature where the microbes can do their work, where they'll be happy. This chart just lists some of the typical favorite carbon and nitrogen source materials that composters like me use. The fallen leaves I keep, and I keep them from through the year. I always have a pile of leaves in my yard, and it's nice to have that in case I don't have anything that's brown enough in the summertime, or I don't have newspapers handy to shred up into little pieces. The leaves are a wonderful product. Straw, shredded newspaper, shredded non-glossy paper, wood bark or chips, pine needles, sawdust. I want to mention here that you see shredded and actually crushed eggshells, but shredded materials are important because by shredding, ripping, tearing, breaking down these materials, you're increasing the amount of surface area available for oxygen, water, microbial activity. And it really speeds up the process of decomposition. The other thing I want to mention here is shredded non-glossy paper. I want to just take a minute to talk about glossy paper and paper that just feels kind of smooth to the touch, even if it's not high gloss. You want to be very careful about, because it oftentimes has a plastic coating on it. And that's one of the things I worry about, is adding more microplastics to my environment. So I stay away from any glossy paper. And the other thing is, in terms of dryer lint, and this is just my preference, I added the natural fabrics only because, and I use wool, bamboo, cotton, and linen fabric lint from the dryer. But a lot of our clothing today, especially I do a lot of exercising and hiking, and a lot of my clothing now has synthetic components in it. And I don't want those components leaching into my compost bin. I don't want to be having my plants uptake those items. On the nitrogen side, vegetative kitchen waste is a biggie, and coffee grounds and tea grounds, plant trimmings. And unless you're sure that your compost bin is going to be really at 150 degrees, don't add any weeds with seed heads or invasive plant roots. There are a lot of invasive plants that will reseed themselves just from a tiny piece of a stem or a root. And so I think it's important to say that more than once. Grass clippings, I would only use if it's untreated. So if anybody has used a lot of synthetic fertilizers or weed killers like herbicides and pesticides on their grass, my feeling is that should not be introduced into your compost, because you're spreading those toxins or those synthetics. And the last caveat I want to say is we put in blood and bone meals and cow, horse, or chicken manures, but I think we have to be careful about where that's sourced from, because in addition to antibiotics given to farm animals, there's also a big concern about pesticides and herbicides used, and synthetic fertilizers used to treat the animal feed and to keep insects and pests out of the animal bedding. So if you know the farmer, that's fine. But if you don't, I would buyer beware. This chart I pulled from Cornell. Cornell has a wonderful composting website, and I encourage anybody who's really serious about composting to go to that website and just kind of read through and explore. This piece that I pulled I did that again, I'm sorry. I pulled because I thought it was interesting to see what are the biggest carbon sources. If you need more carbon in your pile, it's helpful to know that the carbon to nitrogen ratio for newspaper or cardboard is like 560 to 1. And it goes down the line until you get to manure, where it's between 5 and 25 carbon to 1 nitrogen. So it's important to know if you're looking for some really good carbon sources to balance out your pile, that there are sources that will tell you how you can kind of fix your proportion. And what not to compost. Importantly, if we're using a service like Blue Earth Compost, we can put a lot of these materials on this chart into the green compost bucket that goes out to the street for pickup. Their program uses this closed system that heats bones, grease, milk, cheese, butter to such a high temperature that, and doesn't lose the gases, that it's possible for them to take those on. And I have a green bin from Blue Earth Composting here at my house for those items that I really can't add to my compost. So the dairy, meat and fish scraps and bones and oils, diseased plant material, I wouldn't put anywhere except into the garbage or let it, if it's diseased, I don't want to spread the disease. And I don't want any pesticide or herbicide treated plant material. And I don't want any invasive weeds like mugwort that spread with just a tiny piece of the plant. And I've spent hours and hours trying to rid areas of mugwort, so I'm sensitive about that, as I am about Japanese knotweed, which is also an incredible reproducer. So I'm really cautious about those weeds. Those weeds actually I solarize. I spread them on grass in the backyard or wherever I'm working on removing invasive plants. And then when they're completely dried, I throw them in the trash just in case. I want to say one thing about pet feces. I didn't make this chart, so pet feces, it says non-carnivores, okay. Well, there's the same caveat. I want to make this exception that if we don't know what the farmer has been using with the animals, I would not use the non-carnivorous pet feces either. And coal or charcoal ashes may contain chemical residues, and I think you need to know that. So it's not safe to throw those into your pile. And again, as I mentioned earlier, glossier color magazines and paper are not okay. So what about oxygen and water? Decomposing microorganisms have to have oxygen and water in order to survive. And if they don't have them and your pile becomes compressed and wet and soggy and kind of a mushy mess, they're not going to survive. And you can add a lot of carbon, but you're going to have to attract those microorganisms back again. It's going to be a big setback for your compost producing project. So optimally, pile should be aerated twice a month. I have a nice compost bin turner, which is a pole with sort of wings on the bottom of it that pulls up, and I push it around the pile 3 or 4 times, maybe more. And just it moves the material around. It creates air pockets, and it produces, and that creates places for the microorganisms to operate and for water to flow through to make sure it doesn't become too dry in areas either. The pile should be damp, should be constructed on well-drained soil and throughout the pile. So you want to make sure that when you're adding carbon, you do add some water over the top. You don't want it to feel like a pond. It should feel like a wrung out sponge. If oxygen is too low or the pile's too wet, then you end up with your stinky, slimy pile that neighbors object to. And we don't want to go there. And you're not going to get your compost on a timely basis. So that's a problem. I'm going to talk about quite a bit about the hot composting specifications because this is what a lot of people aim for. Now that I have more time to spend on my composting project, this is what I'm aiming for. And I actually, the first item is the proper carbon nitrogen ratio. I've been doing a lot better at trying to establish that as I'm adding things to my compost pile, that I'm targeting 25 to 30 parts carbon for 1 part nitrogen initially. And then as you go along, which gets your pile started and gets the microbial activity started on an ongoing basis, I put in what I have available, but I always make sure I have leaves available. In order to get to the hot composting part, we need to have activators, and that means we need microorganisms initially. And as time goes on, we need macroorganisms like beetles and worms coming in to the pile. And on an ongoing basis, we have to have proper moisture, or the critters that live in there will leave. They'll vacate or die. And the adequate interior pile temperature is critical. 130 to 150 degrees maintained for about 3 to 5 days. When you get to 150, you're killing the weed seeds. And if you get to 160, you're going to kill all the microorganisms. They'll die. So I did invest in, it's very inexpensive, a thermometer. It's got a kind of a long stem on it that I can poke into the middle of the compost pile and figure out if it's hot enough before I turn it. So I know that there's a lot of activity happening in the middle of the pile on an ongoing basis. It also needs this oxygen. So then after I figure out that it's nice and hot in there, I keep turning it on a regular basis. And I want in between my turning for it to get back up to 150 degrees or so. It's interesting that there's research that's been done that shows that there's sort of a perfect ideal pile size. And so we are the beneficiaries of that research. If we had a pile that was square, 4 by 4 by 4, it would be it would create ideal conditions for the middle of the pile to be at between 130 and 150 degrees most of the time. So we would be expediting and accelerating the decomposition process. The middle of the pile gets really hot, and then you kind of spread that out by turning it and adding a little bit more water. And so it's kind of like, in a way, like making bread. You know, if you have the right conditions, you have some good starches, you have some, in this case, the right amount of carbon and some nitrogen to throw in there. And then you keep turning and adding the air and a little water. You're going to have you just have to wait for the process to finish and pause if you want to complete the process and you want some completed compost. You'll have to pause before adding any new material. How to build a pile? This is what I do. I take a pile of my kitchen scraps and garden greens that have been trimmed, and I throw those into my pile. And then I add dried leaves, straw, mulch, hay, shredded paper, wood shavings, all to be twice again the amount. So for every 1 part of green, I'm adding 2 parts of brown matter to soak up all the moisture out of the green. So I end up with a final blend of 2/3 brown and 1/3 green. And I alternate the layers, adding to the brown a little water so that it doesn't dry out. And it's kind of like building a lasagna that I'm going to bake in the oven. So I have all the right ingredients, I have all the right materials, but that green needs to be sandwiched between browns in order to create the compost. And for those of you who are really intense, there are online calculators available for home composters if you want to search out exactly what you should be doing for your particular pile at any point in time. So I have one listed here, and I encourage you to go and take a look, or you can just Google online calculators for home composters, and you'll have some ideas to what's available out there for people who are crazy about this. Oh, I lost my, I'm sorry, I went to the website. Oh. So I just went to that website. Sorry, you can do that on your own. So I just want to reiterate the importance of the interior pile temperature. The microbial decomposition process releases heat. And if you have ideal conditions in the middle of your pile, you're getting to the right temperature. Different microbes will move in based on the temperature, interior pile temperature. The ideal internal temperature is between 130 and 150 for hot composting. That's going to get you a finished compost on a timely basis. At 130, you're destroying most, 150, you're destroying most seed and most plant and soil pathogens and most seeds. And above 160 degrees, most microbes will be killed. So you want to keep that in mind. And if you're going to be serious, you do need a compost thermometer. This chart and graph really shows you how the process occurs. And you can see that as the temperature of the pile increases, there's a rapid uptake of soluble sugars and starches, and it causes the temperature of the pile to increase. And there's it results in an explosive growth of mesophilic bacteria and fungi. At which point, when you get high enough to about 150, there's a mixed population of thermophilic bacteria, which are really heat loving, and the most heat tolerant fungi. You don't want to get over that. That's the active stage where the breakdown of proteins, fats, cellulose are occurring. And then the pile moves into a curing stage, at the end of which you will have produced this organic, fabulous mixture called humus. There are a lot of microorganisms needed to break down the carbon and the nitrogen. And I just wanted you to see this soil food web. What's really happening in your pile is there are predators and shredders and grazers and higher level predators that are all helping to break down material in your soil to produce food for your plants that they can use, that they can take up. One of the most important pieces of advice for a brand new composter is to make sure that you start with some microorganisms in your pile. So you're putting in leaves and you're putting in some greens, but if you add a shovel full of manure or finished compost, or even soil, just regular soil from your garden, it will already have a lot of microorganisms in it, and they will be so happy to be in your pile, they'll start to reproduce quickly. The other most popular type of composting is the cold pile. And this is very brief because it's really a passive situation. You don't have to wait for the process to finish to continually add new materials to it. The decomposition takes place at lower temperatures. Anything over 28 degrees Fahrenheit will result in some microbial activity. The temperature in this pile, it's hard to say how hot it's going to get. It depends upon where it is and what materials are in it and how much you continually are adding to it. But certainly if you add ground materials and shredded materials, rather than big chunks of wood shreds or big hunks of hay or so forth and so forth, if it's all split up and shredded, it will move faster, but it will not kill weed seeds and plant and soil pathogens, more than likely. So you'll be spreading those. And I picked up some compost at a plant sale not long ago, And when I was there, one of the other gardeners at the sale mentioned to me that she had purchased compost there the preceding year, and that she had all these weeds in her gardens that she'd never seen before. And then when she went to the farmer's fields, the farmer who provided the compost that she had purchased, she saw all those same weeds all over the place. So she just said that compost was not heated to an adequate temperature. And what she did, what that farmer did, was share all those weed seeds with her. It just created so much work for her, and compost should really reduce maintenance in your garden. I just added on top of my garden and my lawn, everything on my property, about an inch of it in total every year. That's enough so that there's not excess nutrient in there. There are no excess nutrients that are going to leach out and go down into my groundwater. But it's enough to provide material for consumption for all of my growing matter, and to keep my soil healthy. If your soil is healthy, your plants will thrive. Your plants will flourish, provided they're planted in the right sunny place or shady spot. But it's really important to know. And I do, by the way, at the bottom of this slide, there's an indication that you may need to screen the compost before use. I bought a screen too. It's a wooden frame with a piece of screen over it about a 1/4 inch thick that I put over on top of my wheelbarrow, and I pour compost on top, and it leaves the sticks and chaff that I've actually added in order to increase aeration and air spaces in my pile, separates those out. They can go back into the pile again. But coming down through that screen is the most fabulous black gold compost. And it's amazing to me every time I see it that I produced that. So I think it's important to engage in the process, and just it's incredible to see what I can produce and what has benefited my yard and all my plants just with the materials from my own yard and kitchen. And the last piece I'm going to talk about is a brief discussion of compost structures that are available on the market. The simplest is the compost pile, like my leaf pile in the backyard. It's really easy to turn. I sometimes turn it into another pile. I put the wet leaves on the bottom, on the top. I just move one pile from left to right or right to left, and it requires no construction. It's really accessible. However, as I mentioned, it's a passive pile, and weed root seeds and pathogens will not be killed. It's not contained well enough to generate that amount of heat in the middle. If you're putting food scraps in there, it may generate odors. And it may attract wildlife if food is incorporated. And I try to avoid that. Always put whatever green material you put into whatever kind of compost bin, always cover it with brown matter, with the carbon matter that's going to soak up the moisture and the smell. And then there are a lot of simple ways that we can create our own compost bins. Wrapping chicken wire in a circle, in a square with 4 posts to create maybe your 4x4x4, wooden structures, pallets, using pallets, just to contain it so that it's possible to create a system that's going to generate more heat. And I've used all of these. Store-bought plastic compost bins and tumblers are really important to me because sometimes I have kitchen waste that has to go outside, and I do not want to attract any vermin. I don't want to have animals going through my compost, and I don't want to have them living in there or near there or in my yard. I am an advocate for this type of container that has a cover that screws on tight. They're available in many places. I have to say, Tractor Supply has been very good to me on this count. Keeps leaves and other matter from blowing around or shifting. It's easy to add some water to the top of it. It's easy to turn the pile. I use my compost turner and I just keep jabbing. If I feel that it's not getting enough air, I turn the pile with the turner, with my turner pole, and I add a little water or leave it open to the air as long as I need to in order to feel like the compost is looking like it's coming together. And I add more brown matter as needed because it's not open to the air. In summary, we talked about what is composting, why it matters, what are good ingredients to add, do's and don'ts, and especially the don'ts, things to stay away from, things that you don't want to have your plants and vegetable plants uptake. And compost structures. There are a lot of different compost structures available on the market. And this is just my little earth machine poster. In the spring, we're stirring our compost and adding some soil to jumpstart it because it's been quiet all winter. And take the compost from the bottom. Here's one of those big plastic containers. I'm sorry they're plastic, but I can just shovel out the completed compost from the bottom, put it in my wheelbarrow and distribute it. And then in the summertime, we keep the process going, adding greens and browns. In the wintertime, if it's at least 28 degrees out, some decomposition is going to take place. And then in the fall, again, we can unload and sift through our compost and figure out what's usable in there, especially with a screen, if you're going through kind of a mixed bin. I have some references and some people to acknowledge because they contributed information to this presentation. I'm very grateful and thank you for coming. And I'm interested in any questions you have.